Thank you. This is not just a long version of the presentation yesterday, although, given how much I had to rush, I could do that. But rather, I wanted to talk to you about something that has been quite central to my research agenda in many ways. Let me share the screen. Indeed, I talked about these things last year for my presidential address at the Econometric Society, but now we have been, and there is lots of echo. We have been writing up this paper, which I should say is co-author with Ingrid Almash and Pamela. I don't know why it disappears from this slide, but we have been writing up a paper, so I've been thinking even more about these issues. And given the theme of the conference and or even of the summer school on the use of models in economics and how we bring them to test their implication and use them, I thought that it might be interesting. It would definitely be very useful for me to receive any feedback because, as I said, we are in the process of writing this up, so that will be useful. So,
set the slides on full screen. It's on the way.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you see my slide?
Yeah, wonderful. Like this.
Okay.
That's good.
So this is my the outline of the talk today, and I do not have 93 slides. I've quite fewer than that. But what I've done with these slides is that I messed up a bit because, for instance, the co-author is Calatorto, which is another set of slides. But anyway, the co-authors are Ingrid Almash and Pamela Jervis. And I will send a proper corrected set soon. But what I've done in these, I don't put lots of papers in the slides and lots of citations. Rather, I put some buttons that of references, and so there are about 20 pages of references at the end. So once I correct them, I will send them to Hans so that it can be circulated and people can actually get the exact references. And so what I'll do, I will, the first part, which is section 2 and 3, I will give some considerations about how measurement is used in conjunction theory in what we do. Talk about what we measure and what until recently we thought we could not measure, and then after preaching this sermon, I will try to put some flesh in it, and so I will go down to a specific model of individual behavior. So this is my work on child development and parental investment, of which I did talk to yesterday, and show this simple model, which is quite similar to the one I briefly discussed yesterday, and then show you some results that we got a few years back. We went to do a relatively small pilot in Tanzania. And the aim of that grant and the research was explicitly to pilot different measures in conjunction with traditional measures. And so I will be talking about those and show one possible way that could be used. It's definitely not the only way that those measures could be used. So in what partly inspired this this lecture and the material behind it is that for many years, many economists thought that good empirical work can only be based on a very limited set of measures. And so the prevalent perception, not uniformly, but as we discussed, was that we can only measure what people do, choices, and so what they buy, whether they work, how much they work, and so on. Measure their resources, their income, for instance, or their wages and stuff, and prices. When they buy apples and pears, we will know the prices of these objects. And then possibly from these measures, one could infer preferences and other structural parameters and features of the market structure. So whether there is monopolistic competition or perfect competition and the like. However, when you study econometrics, you learn that there are lots of identification problems. Often this identification of the structural parameters that we're interested in can be achieved only with very strong assumptions on a variety of things, including tastes, beliefs, people's expectations, people's information, and the like. And often these strong assumptions were needed because activists' beliefs and expectations were perceived as unmeasurable. And so there was quite a bit of skepticism towards questions and questionnaires that pose hypothetical situations. The reference to my talk yesterday is apparent here. And instead, the evidence should be based on actual rather than stated choices. So economists were quite skeptical about asking questions. Oh, what would you do if the situation was like that? Now, there are very good reasons for relying on a revealed preferences approach. Measuring hypotheticals, preferences, attitudes is fraught with lots of difficulties. There are framing effects and several biases that can be introduced. There has been an interesting debate, for instance, on the use of contingent evaluation. Jerry Hasman wrote 2 papers in the General Economic Perspective, one in '94 and one in 2012. In the first one, he calls the use of contingent evaluation dubious. In 2012, he calls it hopeless for the sort of biases that these type of measures induce. And there are even stronger views. There is a paper in the AER by Gary Becker and George Stigler, published in 1977, which is a very nice sounding Latin title, which is De Gustibus Res Disputandum. And this is a quote from that paper where they say, taste neither change capriciously nor differ importantly between people. And this is an important point because the way heterogeneity is treated is important. And then they go on to say, one does not argue over tastes. Mountains, both they're there, they will be there next year too, and are the same to all men. I guess women were not included in this discussion at the time. There have been in the profession some really interesting and lively discussions. Back in the 50s, for instance, there was interesting debate between James Tobin and George Katona. George Katona was a psychologist who worked a lot on measuring and constructing surveys. Incidentally, he was one of the founders of the survey of consumer sentiment that still goes on now at the University of Michigan. and has received quite a bit of attention. And he was working on buying intentions. So there was a data set that was collected at the time where people were asked questions about their intention to buy cars. And Tobin analyzed those data afterwards and claimed that there were a bunch of issues that were related to the inability for people stating, answering questions in response to hypothetical answers. Tom Jaster was another interesting contributor to this. Tom Jaster was incidentally, was one of the founders of the PSID, which is, a data set that we all love and use, and has been used in several presentations during the conference in these days. And Tom Jaster went back to the debate between Tobin and Katona and reanalyzed the buying intention data. He also ran a really interesting survey which originated a paper that he wrote in 1964. As I say, all these citations are listed at the end of the slides. There are about 10 pages of them. And I will send those slides to Hans for those who want to look at that. The paper by Justin O'Shea, published in 1964 in an NPR booklet, was about hypothetical car loans. So he ran a survey and they asked a random set of people, if you were to buy a $2,000 car and you were offered this set of different loans, that different in interest rate maturity, which one would you choose? And then he randomized the type of offers, the hypothetical offers that they gave to people. And the idea was to use that variation, which was fully controlled of the car loan demand to maturity interest rate, with an idea to test the presence of borrowing restrictions. This was a beautiful paper, way ahead of its time. We're talking about 1964, and he was talking about liquidity constraints and the like, stuff that we still, argue about to this day. So there were really interesting discussions at the time, and the discussion on what to measure and how to do it goes back a long time. There's Bloch and Marshak on random utility models that have this. This is another nice quote. If you read the part, the blue part of the quote is to say that we might admit the ranking by the subjects answering the questions of 3 or more objects as an observable fact. So here they're saying, you can ask a guy to rank their preferences among different objects, and then as economists, as researchers, we would treat those answers as facts, as a real stuff. And then they go on to say we might even admit as observable the subject verbal statement of the relative intensity of his preferences. And there are some related papers by Luce and Taki, Luce and Subs. A beautiful site is by Adelmo. This is an econometric, the 1958 presidential address to the Econometric Society, in which he talks about the need to go beyond revealed preferences. And they actually flip the argument on its head, and he says, if we the last part of the quote, it is my belief that if we can develop more explicit and priori convincing economic models in terms of variables, these variables are, hypothetical and intentions and the like, then we will eventually find methods to actually measure these objects. Having said all that, there were all these contribution discussions, but the consensus went towards an almost exclusive revealed preferences approach. Now, this is not completely true because experimental economists have been using, been constructing attempts to measure directly preferences, beliefs, attitudes that people have. And at the beginning, this was mainly work that happened in labs with students or other subjects. Often these attempts were characterized by an encouragement to the subjects in the experiment in the lab to abstract from their circumstances and to behave in a completely abstract way. So there was this divorce between attempts to measure stuff in the lab on preferences mainly and attitudes from measuring what people actually do. And as you will see, our attempts at the end will be to combine instead these measures, to combine revealed preferences measures to stated choices, as we did yesterday with Flavio and Pamela when we were trying to combine the beliefs data with the actual parental investment data. And this was the early attitude of experimental economists. More recently, however, the experiments have been brought to the field, and the data have been collected together with observational data, as we'll see later in the talk. And this could be preferences for attitudes towards redistribution, attitudes towards migrant. Even Stephanie Stanchev has been doing quite and others interesting work on that, or data on bargaining and social preferences, reciprocity in conflict areas, willingness to compete in the like. And things have been changing. There has been some interesting discussion about what we could and should measure. There is a really nice volume that I actually discovered a few months ago. So after I delivered my presidential address last year, it's edited by Andrew Kaplan and Andrew Schott. And there are some interesting papers. The first one is by Gull and Pessendorfer, and it's against all this. It's for, so those are the two prominent and really clever theories that argue for the exclusive use of revealed preferences data and complex models. And then Colin Kammerer, so they call that mindless economics because the reference is to measures of brain activity and the like. And instead, Colin Kammerer, that has been a proponent of that, argues for mindful economics. It's an interesting discussion. Personally, I find really interesting bits in both papers. As I will argue, our position is a little bit in the middle between these two. And so now, because of this evolution, several studies use stated preferences to model consumption behavior. Sometimes they try to use the stated preferences in combination with revealed preferences. Researchers have been moving away from models that imply full rationality. Indeed, the part of the discussion between Gull and Pessendorfer and Kammerer is about, what do economic models say? And Gull and Pessendorfer said rightly, argue, an economic model does not need necessarily to assume full rationality, optimal behavior, and the absence of imperfections and frictions. One can change them and should probably change the model to try to understand mistakes people do, imperfections, non-rational beliefs, and no rational expectations and the like. In a way, our attempt yesterday in the paper that I presented, we were relaxing the assumption that parents know the production function of human capital and try and choose investment as with the distorted beliefs about that production function. Now, our attempt was, I was to say, well, we can try to measure that stuff directly. And then Gul and Christopher were a little bit skeptical about that. Or not just skeptical, but they argue against the usefulness of doing that. Colin Cameron instead goes the other way and argues for rich measures of how the brain operates and all that. And I think the other nice thing that is happening there is some innovative work that has been done in terms of measures, using data on policy preferences, using data on information. The New York Fed has promoted now for a number of years the elicitation of subjective expectations. And those are very useful in my opinion, because then you can estimate model trying to avoid rational expectations assumptions. So these data are being used to estimate model of retirement choices, in education and occupational choices. Again, some of the papers that we discussed at the conference in the last 2 days hinted towards that direction. And then the measurement of beliefs and perceptions, measurement of people's attitude. As I said, there are these references here. This is an example, and then you can go back, go at the end of, I think, to the list of actual paper. It's going to screw up with this buttons. So what I will do today, I will cover two things on the importance of measurement. The first is what we measure, and what is the relationship between economic theory and measurement. And then I will argue that it's useful to go beyond the standard concepts. Then I will talk very briefly about measurement system. Yesterday, there were several, or in the last 2 days, several papers refer to the use of measurement systems. And I think that is important because, if you go down this route of measuring new stuff, you come soon to the realization, or in general, if you collect data, you come soon to the realizations that measurement error is everywhere and is important. And I think it should be recognized as such. And so it's very useful to augment the theoretical model to explicitly consider the presence of measurement error. And you do that with the measurement system, which is effectively a mapping between the concepts, the abstract concepts, the related factors we're interested in, and what we actually use. And then after that, I will provide some examples of measurement work and its use within the context of modeling child development and parental investment. And then we'll present some new work that we've done in Tanzania on this. So the empirical work is very different from the stuff that I did yesterday. Okay. The awful thing about Zoom is that you don't see people's faces. And so I hope that you're not fell asleep on what I was saying. And do interrupt if if there are questions on things. So let me pause for 1 second to ask, if there are any questions or comments or feedback. Okay, I guess I'll continue. When doing economic theories, the economic models we work with often use abstract constructs that are not directly observable. And so the measures we collect and use are driven by the theoretical framework that organizes our thinking. Now, this is nothing new. This has always been the case. Indeed, the existence of national accounts and the way national accounts were constructed in the first part of the 20th century, so almost 100 years ago, were inspired by the economic theory that were used at the time. So the work that Richard Stone was doing on national accounts was inspired by economic models were constructed by Keynes and others. So all this old work says that effectively this is exactly the same system. Or if you're worried about inflation and you want to construct price indices, and again, Richard Stone was an important contributor to this literature. You have to make references to a demand system and how you can construct price indices depending on the assumptions on preferences that give rise to demand systems, and then the type of price indices you compute will be informed by the specific assumptions you make on preferences. And so there is nothing new in saying, or surprising in saying that the economic models actually inform what we measure and how we measure. Here I should have mentioned Terence Gorman work on preferences in the 50s, in which he made it clear what assumptions you need in the utility function so that it's legitimate and meaningful to use a single price index to measure inflation. Or the work that Peter and Neubauer did in the 80s on the almost ideal demand systems. So in practice, what we often have is what I like to call markers that relate to the latent factor that populated the theoretical models that we use. When Eric was presenting his work yesterday, he was referring to this variety of measures that can represent, can reflect the influence of the latent factor we're interested in. Here is another beautiful quote. This is from Art Goldberger's paper in 1972. Essentially, I strongly advise reading that paper. This was in Econometrica. This is the Fischer-Schultz lecture. In addition to these issues, they also contain some really interesting history about the evolution of these concepts and anecdotes on the life of Sewell Wright in the 30s. And in this quote, Goldberger says, by structural equation models, it refers to stochastic models in which each equation represents a causal link rather than a mere empirical association. And the model arises in all experimental situations and are characterized by simultaneity and or errors in the variables. The error in the variables might be due to measurement error in the narrow sense, just a mistake in answering the equation, in transcribing the equation. Also, the fact that these measurable quantities are not the same as the relevant theoretical quantities. Generally speaking, the structural parameters do not coincide with the coefficient of regressions among the observable variables, but the model does impose constraints on these regression coefficients. And then it goes on to discuss identification. And I really like this link between what we measure and how we measure and the identification problem that often we face when dealing with theoretical models and trying to bring them data. So I think we should be explicit about what is the focus of the theoretical model we're studying, what kind of questions we're asking, and what is observable and what is not, given the available data. And I think this is useful apart from imposing intellectual discipline. It's also useful because it might induce you, if you are in the business of collecting data, and our group has been doing this now for a number of years, in trying to design the relevant variables. You know, in a way, the little anecdote I told yesterday, you know, we ran this RCT in Colombia and we got a set of results and we interpreted them with a model. And then we said, why did this happen? And that induced us to design the beliefs questions because we thought that there was an important and possible question that could be answered with new measures. So the possibility of measuring new factors can allow us to use more realistic models and then subject this model to less stringent assumptions. So what to measure? Now we can represent the theoretical framework with this equation, f of theta phi equals 0, where theta are the latent factors we're interested in. So theta is a matrix of factors. And the phi is the parameter that characterizes the function f. F is the theory. And the function f represents individual behavior and interactions. That's the model. The function f typically defines what are the latent factors of interest. And you know, we can make f flexible and rich in a way. That was the Gulen-Pessendorfer theory. You can incorporate mistakes, people's mistakes. You can incorporate imperfections and the quality of information that people have. The issue is that the richer and more realistic f function typically requires a richer set of factors and richer measurement to be brought to data. That's where comes the measurement system, which is m are the measures, so theta are again the same factors, and they are mapped by this function g, and they, you know, the theta are hidden by the presence of the epsilon matrix, which is a measurement error. The nature of the measurement system depends on the economic models we're interested in. You know, we'll go back to the example that Cunha, Heckman, and Shenak used of a measurement system, because that has been a very useful contribution. But you know, it goes back in time. In Goldberger 72, he uses permanent income model as an example. In the permanent income model, permanent income is unobservable, and that's the concept of interest. What is observable is current income and consumption, and the two are linked in a specific way, and then you can try to use measures to infer. Grillich is, you know, again, something that was implicitly present in some of the papers we saw in the last few days, discussing the relationship between earnings, schooling, and ability, where ability is often unobserved, and discusses how you can solve these identification problems. When you think about the production functions of stuff with endogenous inputs, you know, the Olympic strategy that has been then later developed by a bunch of others is also examples of this type, where the economic models includes factors that are not necessarily observable, and when you have measures that cannot do that. So there is often a trade-off between richer measures and stronger and less realistic assumptions. You know, an example about information, if you want to rely, do not want to, we can rely on subjective expectations data, and then you have direct measures of individual expectations, direct measures of perceived risk. You can hook them out of learning, or you can say, look, I'm willing to assume rational expectations. And then, you know, you're forced then to identify risk from time series and cross-sectional variations in data. Or there's a recent interesting paper by Chen, Hansen, and that person that get set identification in model which you relax rational expectations. You can have a data on beliefs about processes like we did yesterday, or you assume full knowledge of relevant processes. You can have stated preferences, and we can try to infer a state for different commodities, a taste for different commodities, discount factor, risk aversion. You know, Colin Camera would go into people's brain to measure risk aversion. You know, I have some skepticism for that, but answers to hypothetical questions can be used for that, or you rely on revealed preferences, and then you have often make assumptions about parameters, and especially you're very limited in the way you treat heterogeneity. You know, the quote by Stigler and Becker on the Rocky Mountains and tastes being the same for all people is indicative of that. And there are additional important measures with Ingrid and Pedro Camero. We've been doing some work on measuring bargaining power within couples, and we've redone it in Tanzania, and we'll say something about that. With Sonia Krutrikova, we've been using data from Tanzania to measure the quality of the information available to agents within an extended family. And so, as I said, we'll talk a little bit about our work in Tanzania later on. The second is how do we go from theory to measures? So the first issue that we need to address is what are the relevant latent factors in their dimension. And that's, you know, again, should be, answer to this question should be driven by the type of questions that you ask. You know, when you talk about human capital, is human capital just a scalar, a single variable, or is it a multidimensional factor? And the answer to that question, there is no right answer. The answer depends on what kind of problems you're interested in. You know, we know that different occupations map into different skills, or do they refer different combinations of skills? Do individuals have and use different combinations of skills? And how are these skills accumulated? So depending on what you study, you might want to answer those questions differently, and then use different measures. And the second issue is what individuals know in the model, and what is observable to us, to researchers, and what's observable to decision makers. So those are some important questions. And as I said, the answer to those questions will depend on the type of issues we are analyzing. And then, having done that, then we have to find a way to relate the factors we're interested in to the available measures. Again, this is, you know, if Jim was here, it would shout at me and say, look, this is nothing new. This has been for a long time. And I agree. And those are some of the papers. You know, Sheila Wright wrote some of this stuff in 1934. And this is common across different disciplines. This is sort of problems that are relevant in psychology, in sociology, in genetics. But I think there are still problems that remain open. and on which work is necessary. And as economists, I think there are important discussions to be had, and there are important advances that can be made in promoting measures. The measurement system is something that, as we said, it maps the latent factors, the theta, to the end. Cunha, Heckman, and Shenak in their 2010 econometrica paper, they use this particular version of, although some of the results are, they show identifiability in a non-parametric way, in the end, often people use parametric specification. It's useful to be aware of the identifiability without relying on parametric assumptions. So that's a useful way to write down a model. So we have this latent factor theta. There are several of them. There are K, there are big J or K. And for each of them, there are big K available measures. So this is measure JK that relates factor J for individual I at time T to what we observe. And the parameters here are the alpha and the beta. The alpha measures how discriminating a specific measure is about this factor, while the beta determines the saliency of that measure for that factor. And epsilon is the measurement error. Now, in order to identify the parameters of these models, you need assumptions and assumptions about the data availability. One assumption you need is that you need at least two measures per factor. And the intuition is obvious. By averaging two measures, if the measurement error is independent across at least two measures, you average out the measurement error, and so you can isolate the theta. And you need to make typically some, as I said, non-parametric identification might be possible with enough measures, but typically you make an assumption about the distribution of theta, and you can be flexible on that. In this specific example, this is what we call a dedicated system where a factor maps into a measure. It's a unique factor that maps in a measure. You can have more complex models in which there are several factors that map into a single measure. However, to get to, you still need some restrictions, some exclusion restrictions for identifiability. And I already said that the theory must be key in informing the measurement strategies, and with sufficient measurement allows identification of causal links. That that effectively is what Goldberger was saying in his 1972 paper. And in a sense, the construction of RCTs, randomized controlled trials that are so popular these days, could be interpreted as a measurement issue. There, you get assignment to treatment people to be controlled. So to establish causal links between variables, it might be useful to collect information on the drivers of people's choices. And again, you can do that by running an RCT. If you cannot run an RCT, and even when you do run an RCT, it's useful to get identification using information on other stuff. It could be prices, environmental factors, past events, changes that are exogenous to the outcome of interest. Yesterday I was citing our work in Colombia on the second paper where we tried to understand where the impact that we measured in the RCT was coming from. And there we could not use the RCT as an instrument for parental investment. And so we had to collect data on drivers of that. Having argued with the referees to that paper for some time. I think we do have convincing instruments for that. And those are driven, again, by the way you measure things. The second issue is that how you aggregate available measure. In a way, a good measurement system can be interpreted as an effective way to aggregate and summarize the available measures and items. The work that Eric was doing 2 days ago, I was showing and discussing 2 days ago, explicitly make a reference to the strategy. One thing that I like to mention, this is driven by my work on child development. When we start doing that work and we start using a test of child development, you buy a test from a publisher, and this test comes with as a set of questions that you ask either the mother or test that you impose on which are often used in psychometrics, so that you convert a set of binary variables, or often binary or discrete variables, into a score. Those are black boxes. And then if you are brave enough to read the 200 pages manual that come with this test, you discover that the scoring algorithms were constructed decades earlier by some psychometricians or psychologists on a sample of children that were used to construct that test, and they were maybe living in Florida. And so if you use the scoring algorithm that comes with the Woodcock-Johnson test or the Bailey School of Infant Development, which has been these are the standard tests that people use in publications and stuff that have been recognized by the profession. But effectively, you're saying that the measurement system that these psychometricians used in Florida in the 70s is the same as the measurement system that is relevant for the children in Tanzania today. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that often the scoring algorithm, apart from giving a huge monopoly power to the publisher of this test, are obsolete and are oversimplified. The MacArthur-Bates developmental inventories test, which is a great test. I really like it. It's incredibly useful. So you give the mother 100 words and you ask for each word whether the child can say it or not. So it's relatively easy to implement and it's transparent and all that. Having said that, they advise to scoring to just sum up the number of words that the child can say out of the 100, which is a way to do it. It's simple. It's not necessarily the most efficient way to use that, because you serve a child of 5 that can say or can understand the word mother. Can understand the word, I don't know, some much more complex word. That's quite informative about the development of that child. I guess what I'm trying to say is different signals, different markers have different information about the parameters, the factors we're interested in. They might have different betas to the equations that I put on the slide earlier. And there is no need to use the standard algorithm. You can go out and estimate your own measurement system. And indeed, now, even Stata does that for you.
One question coming in by Eric, who asked, in the psychometrics literature, are there serious attempts to address the problem that the noisy measurements or markers about binary? That is the usual idea. Assumptions on measurement error will be violated with binary measures.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. One thing that I discovered in the collaborations with the various actors in psychometrics and stuff, there is lots of stuff that gets lost in translations across disciplines, and there are important issues that we discuss about in different disciplines, and we can learn from each other. And the issues, the set of issues that were referred to in the question is definitely relevant. You know, there are issues about well, how do you write the model when you have a discrete variable that can take 4 variables or a binary variable. What assumptions you make of the distribution is, you know, if often people, if you follow my advice and use data to do the rescoring, data by default imposes normality, which is often a decent and a useful assumption. The normality of the factor, of the latent factors that are unobservable, which is often, you know, a decent assumption. But sometimes in some contexts it's not a good assumption. So you might want to use different, maybe more flexible assumptions about the distribution. Or, you know, the way you use can be driven by, it's not just the nonlinearity imposed by given value in binary. So you know whether the child says the word or doesn't say the word. Also, the way the tests are constructed can be very complex. For instance, in many of these tests, you know, the child is presented with a series of problems, and they become progressively harder and harder. But then the rules for administering those tests is that you give the problem, the child solves it, and you go ahead. If the child makes a mistake, then you give another problem. If he makes a mistake, if he makes 5 consecutive mistakes, then you stop. So all these stopping rules and way to administer the child should be taken into account when we construct the measurement system, because that's the way the measures are constructed, and that's the way they are related to the latent factor. So when you know, I wrote a very simple linear system for the measurement system, but in reality, it's often much more complex than that. I hope that I understood the question correctly and that I answered it. So we'll see some example of these things on the work in Tanzania. That's what I said. A big issue, you know, Jim was talking quite a bit about it in this presentation the other day, and probably we'll talk again about it, about is the normalization and anchoring. So, you know, you have an unobserved factor, which is theta. You need to normalize at least one of the alpha and one of the beta, which means that you need to choose the metric that you use. And then the big issue is that, you know, you're implicitly making assumptions about supposedly observing the child development over age. Then you have this age invariance that about which Jim was talking. But more generally, you know, you can discuss about the measurement invariance across populations and villages and contexts and the like. So the normalization in the scale can be important. And then, especially when you follow things over time, it becomes very difficult. So, what is a good index of human development? Is the height at 2 or the wages at 22 or 25? So that's important, especially when you want to do comparability across different contexts. But in psychometrics, there is a quite huge literature on this, and we should be aware of it. My take of that is sometimes that literature is a bit too narrow the assumptions that are imposed, and one doesn't need to be so strict. There is some interesting work in economics. Agostinelli and Winslow have done some interesting paper on that. I've done some work on a specific data set on how to link different ages between 6 and 72 months for children. Which brings me to the last thing before I go into the data and then the example, the strategies for measurement. As I was hinting earlier, the specifying a measurement system in the assumption is useful because it can give you ideas about how you collect the data. One can design survey methods that make the assumptions you make credible. The example I have, and one of my favorite examples, I mentioned when I showed you the measurement system that to achieve identification, you need at least 2 measures on which the measurement error is independent between those 2 measures. Well, what if you are in the business of constructing the data and collecting the data, you can do it in a way to make that assumption hold. For instance, when we did the work in Colombia, we had different tests, maternal report summary where individual did the test to the child. We had different interviewers administering the test to the same household. And you randomly assign the evaluators across these different measures and the timing of data collection. At that point becomes the independence assumption, which is key to identification. It becomes much more plausible. One thing that I learned, to my surprise in a way, if you collect data on this child development and you know the identity of the evaluators, and then you run a regression where you put dummy for the evaluator identity, those dummies are always significant. Which means to say, it should not be a surprise that everybody is a little bit biased in one direction or another. Some guys are a bit more stringent, some guys are a bit more generous in the testing. And you need to be aware of that. And you need to, now to make the data usable, what you want to avoid mistakes like you get one evaluator doing the treatment sample and one evaluator, a different evaluator doing the control sample, because then your results can be driven completely by evaluators' biases. And so you want to randomize evaluators across different observations. And more generally, the point I'm trying to make is that economic models should dictate the type of measures that we collect and how we collect. Okay, so this is my sermon. This is my preaching. Now I'm going to put some flesh in it, and then talk about a model. So this is child development, the parental investment, and then give you some example of the data that we collected.
Orazio, just in terms of timing, you have half an hour left.
There should be enough. Okay, no, I'm fine. Thank you. So child development, especially in the first few years of life, is important as long-term consequences for adult outcomes. And so it's important to understand child development and its determinants. A theoretical framework that is now widely used is this. Is that of child development as the outcome of production function. So Cunha Heckman have done papers on that, Todd and Martin and others. And several studies have looked at the production function of different dimensions of human capital, and these are some of the quotes. You find that in the slides. Now, one issue is to establish the causal links between inputs and outputs. is that some of these inputs are chosen by individual actors like parents or teachers, and therefore it might be very difficult to estimate their impacts. This is the AER paper that we have at the 7S that we specify a control function approach. One of the reasons I like this is because the way we did it is that the estimates of this causal link are valid regardless of the assumptions that one makes about parenting. So when going down to measure child development,
could you give a definition of how the control
sorry?
A control function always often depends on what precisely you put in there so that they work, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, the control function is a slightly more flexible approach than instrumental variable. So identification is valid under specific assumptions on the instruments that we use to construct the control function. In that specific example, you know, we had two types of investment in the AER paper. One was material investment, and one was time investment. So for material investment, we use prices. So we had information in the, so we use only variation across the villages. So remember, we had 96 villages in that paper. So variation in relative prices of things like toys and books and the like across villages. And for time investment, there was a neat piece of work. So we did, we had information on the prevalence of armed conflict in the town at the time the mothers were adolescent. So we can check easily the first stage. So we can check the fact that, you know, that is significant in the regression for time investment. The untestable assumption that you have to justify is that that specific variable is not significant directly. It's an exclusion on child development. And so we can control for in the child development equation, in the production function equation for the conflict, the current level of conflict in those towns in Colombia. And then conditional on that, we assume that the conflict 20 years earlier, or whatever the age of the mother is, so at the time where the mother was an adolescent, does not affect directly child development, but only through the effect that it might have on the mother. So the reason I'm not saying all this to boast about how neat our instrument is, but is to stress the importance of collecting sufficient information and data on this stuff. So when you do child development, you want to know how many dimensions one considers, what are the dynamics of the person, and you know, often you need richer and better and scalable measures. And the scalability is particularly important in developing countries because you need to get the quality of the interviewers that you have to collect the data as well. And this is what I was saying, you know, if you want to establish the causal link between parental investment and child development, then you might want to have enough information on the drivers of parental investment and stuff on the conflict. So it was an example of that. So if you want to sketch a model, this is parents maximizing objective function. Now, this is a bit more general than what I was referring to yesterday. So here we have couples. So there is a husband and a wife. Man and woman in these things. And what is maximized is a weighted average of the utility of the wife and the utility of the husband. And depends on the consumption, on child development. So this is a common public good in the couple, and time spent with the child. There is a budget constraint. This model is static, but I could make it dynamic with savings and maybe the utility age occurring in the future. Why are the available resources? Now, even if the process of child development enters through this production function, F. Now, the parents don't know F, but they think that F is like G. So they have this is the perceived production function. And you can do have different complications. You can have that the perceived production function depends on the perceived initial condition or the initial state of development of the child. Rebecca Dyson-Ross has an interesting paper which she shows some misperceptions that people have on that. You can have multiple children, and so at that point you need to have a preference for equality across children, and you can have preferences reflecting gender biases. However, all this is feasible and it's been done by a number of people. But even in the simplest version of the model, parental investment depends on budget and time constraint. When you have several periods, it might depend on credit constraints, and then on risk and the like. It depends on parental preference for child development. Again, with several periods you'll have to have scan factors. You don't certainly want to introduce risk aversions. With several children, you might have preferences for efficiency and equity. Michele Gianola's paper last year on the market does that in a very nice way. And depends on parental beliefs on the process of child development. So it depends on G rather than F. And so it might be the case that parents don't invest a lot because they think that the returns to that investment are very low, or maybe that investment is very risky. So that's an important factor. And finally, remember there are two people in the couple, and it's not clear who makes the decision. So it might depend on decision power. Now, parental investment, and many of these drivers are not directly observable. And so one could try to get measures of this latent factor that they might identify. So that's what we did. We went to Tanzania and we tried to construct a number of new measures. Some are old measures and standard stuff, but we added the new stuff. So the work in Tanzania was 2 rounds of data collection. We interviewed about 450 households in each round, and we collected data on standard stuff like socioeconomic questionnaires, expenditure, income, wealth, education, demographics, a standard measure of child development and parental investment, and then a number of new measures. In particular, I want to talk about measures on beliefs, very similar to the one I showed you yesterday, mentioning about bargaining power within the marriage and the stated preferences for things. And interesting thing about this data set is that we randomized who answered some of the questions. So in some cases it was the husband that answered, in some cases it was the wife on their own, and in some cases were the two of them together. I'll tell you why this is useful. So we know that, by now, I repeat a number of times that the child development and parental investment are complex, multidimensional constructs. And so this is a good case for using measurement systems to aggregate and even to construct cheaper and more effective measures. Actually, I do want to, there is now a number of efforts that are being made to construct scalable measures. So there is this GSET initiative there, which is funded by the Gates Foundation. They put together 3 different initiatives. One is called DSE, one is called CREDI, one is sponsored by the WHO, to construct the measures of the child development after 36 months. We did something similar, and the way we did it, we did standard measures. We used the Baileys and a few other measures. Then we did the measurement. We did the factor analysis on this data, and we identified a number of latent factors. And for each measure, for each item of the Bailey or the CREDI or various tests, we estimate the alpha and the beta, the saliency and the difficulty of that. And then what we did was to identify items that were particularly useful. And then we say, look, why don't we rather, the Bailey, which is one of the most common tests used for measuring child development up to 42 months, it takes 90 minutes to administer and is made about 100 items. So it's a complex test. So we said, okay, what if instead of doing the 90-something items, we choose a small number of them? What do we get? And that's what we get. So in the first wave, we went and collected data on the Bailey, 91 items. Then we selected, we did the factor analysis, and we selected 5 items from the Bailey and 7 from the CREDI, which is a different test done on maternal report. So, rather than 90 minutes, now you spend 20 minutes measuring the child. And now you do factor analysis in the first wave on the same children using the entire 91 items or using the selected items. And 2 of the 3 curves there are the distribution of factor with these 2 strategies. You can see that they're basically very, very similar. And then in the second wave, we got a new sample of children of the same age and applied just the selected questions. And again, the third curve, the green one, is the distribution of the estimated factor there. In the first way, we can compute the correlation between the estimated factor using the entire Bailey or using the selected items. The correlation coefficient is 0.961. So I guess what we're trying to say is that, especially if you have restrictions on the budget, you have to collect this data. You can get the same information from a much reduced set of items. So this is the Bailey is a classic standard measures, but we say, okay, you can do better, or you can have a most effective use of your funds. And then in addition to that, we did a bunch of stuff, and I'll show you some information on bargaining power, on beliefs, and on individual preferences. So the bargaining power was primarily work that I did with Pedro Carneiro, Alex Armand, and Linda Almas. The paper is published in 18 in the EJ. And so we measured bargaining power within a couple in Macedonia within an RCT. There, we had a sample of 100 villages. This was the evaluation of the conditional cash transfer program. In 50 villages, the money was given to the wives, and in 50 villages, the money was given to the husband. After the data collection, the standard one, we called the wives to an office, and we ran and incentivized the experiment. We basically tell her, here are 100 dinners, and we will give them to your husband. However, how much are you willing to pay to have the then paid to you. We also did an additional hypothetical stake with much larger, 100 dinars is 3 days of work for this population. So it's not a negligible amount, but it's not huge. And then we did one with 10,000 dinars, and but it was hypothetical. This the 100 dinars we actually paid. Here is a summary of the discussion. Say, how much are you willing to pay? The question is actually a bit more complicated. We give them a menu, a sequence of questions. We say, suppose that now we give 100 dinars to you, to your husband, or 90 to you. Which one would you go? And then suppose that she says 90 to me, and we say, well, what if it's 85 to you and 100 to your husband? So we try to identify where is the difference point. And then we pay randomly to one of these 10 or 15 choices. So what we get is that there is a lot of variability in these things. It's linked to a bunch of observable variables, in particular ethnic and religious tendency of these populations. We have both Christians and Muslims, so that makes a huge difference. Interestingly, what we can do is to answer the question: does given the conditional cash transfer to women makes a difference? The idea of this measure is that the more they're willing to pay to get control of this money, the less is their power in the marriage. And indeed, we find that when the government give the wives the conditional cash transfer program, they were willing to pay less. So it seems that the grant did shift power. So we did the same thing in Tanzania, and that's what we get. The amount was 6,600 shillings. Again, this is two or 3 days of work. And the wives were willing to give away more than a third of it, 2,700, to get control of their money. The husbands, now here the question was done also to the husband. As I said, that we have separate samples, randomly allocated between samples, while in Macedonia was only wives. The husband are willing to pay nothing. The difference between the two is 2,000 shillings, and it's very, very different. And so that seems to reflect bargaining power between the marriage. Then we did the stuff on beliefs, very similar to the one that I presented yesterday. As I said yesterday, we are also collecting similar data in India on a longitudinal basis, which they're quite interesting to look at. And so we designed the scenario for the production functions, and we mapped the novelty here, in addition to language development, which is what we were doing in Colombia and in India, we also collected questions about the social-emotional development. And again, we randomized whether the beliefs questions are answered by the father or the mother. And then what we get, again, yesterday I told you that this is for language development, that the returns, the subjective returns are higher for the low initial conditions and for the high initial conditions. And this is for the whole sample, this is for mothers and fathers. So this is the difference between high and low. And you can see, for fathers it's not much, but for mothers, they think that the investment is more productive for low initial conditions. So these are the numbers that they refer to that thing. And then we have a similar thing for social-emotional development. Now, I'm running out of time, so let me skip that. And then we did these preferences with hypothetical scenarios. So the way we do this, we say, okay, this is a certain amount of money. We have these stones that represent this money, and you can allocate them. How would you allocate it across different commodities and across different household members? So we have 6 commodities and 3 household members. The husband, no, the subject, the spouse, is the wife or the husband, depending who's the respondent, and the child. This is very close, to a paper that came out last year in the JPE, a paper I really liked by Amerix, Briggs, Kaplan, and Shakir and Konecki. And they did these strategic survey questions. That's a quote from that paper. They do these hypothetical scenarios, and they try to use the answers to those questions to estimate some of the models of the structural, some of the parameters of the structural model.
Orazio, so
Yeah.
the questions regarding the previous one. So in the collective model, how should we think about the willingness to pay experiment? That is a shift in the bargaining weight?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the question is a number of times because you say, okay, if these women are willing to burn some money to get control, are you rejecting the collective model? My answer to that type of question is no, we're not, because the collective model takes the pie, the Pareto weight, as a given. I guess what you're saying here, we're giving them the possibility of affecting that. And that's why, it's not a rejection of the collective model. It's definitely a rejection of the unitary model, because under unitary model, you should maximize the total amount of money. It's not a rejection of the collective model because, yeah, you burn out some money, but you get control of it. If you're in a situation where you have very little control, you can improve your condition by reducing the total amount of money that the family receives, but getting more control of it. So you're changing the pie in a way, at least for that part of the resources. I hope that clarifies the question. That's a very good question, and a question I've been receiving quite a bit on that piece of data. So on the hypothetical questions, there we have 6 categories that can be more or less matched to the actual one, to the actual expenditure data. So we have clothing, health, food, transportation, learning materials, and school expenditure. And then for each of them, we say, would you spend this on for yourself, for your husband, or for your spouse, or for the child? So we have, 18 boxes that are filled in this thing. And as before, these questions are either answered by the father, the mother, or both together. So we have 3 different samples. So what we find is, so we can test the difference in tastes across husband and wives. And so we find that mothers, when the mother is a decision maker, they allocate more. So these are the total to the child, the spouse, themselves. The mothers allocate more resources to children than fathers. So this is significant. However, they don't. How much they allocate to themselves is not very different. It's not significant. What the difference is how much they allocate to the spouse. So the wives allocate more to the children and less to the spouse. The father does the opposite. And that's a couple of decisions. The other interesting thing is that when they are answering the question together, those are very similar to the father. And so, again, this is an indication, in the bargaining power, we say that the power lies with the husband. And that's reflected here in the fact that the father decisions are very similar to the couple decisions. Then when you dig into the allocation to the child, this is the sixth expenditure. There's a mother decision, father decision, couple decisions. Again, there are some differences here in clothing and food, but not much else. And then we say, okay, can we parameterize a model and use this data together, possibly with standard data, with the revealed preferences data, to estimate these models? And so one could do the whole thing and do a demand system with this data. This is an example with homothetic preferences, but you don't need to do that. You can do more general preferences like AIDS, almost ideal in the line. So this is the, now it's interesting, then you start thinking about what you're estimating. So if you assume a model is unitary, there is just one utility function, then it doesn't matter who answers, and all the alphas in the top values will be the same. Or you can estimate a collective model, then which is here, and then what you're estimating with the homothetic preferences, with the unitary model, you're estimating this, and with the collective model, you're estimating the weighted average between the two. And then, depending on who answers the questions, you want to say, okay, the questions are answered about the additional resources, and so they reflect the preferences of the mother, the father, or the couple. So that's what we discussed. That there is some interesting work. Dunbar et al. And Varela Shen and have a couple of papers using a fairly unique data set from Malawi, in which they get at information on who consumes what. So it's a very detailed data set, and you can get even more with the hypothetical. So we assume that the answers refer to the total expenditure, or the marginal expenditure should be what we give them hypothetically is in addition to what they do. And then at a point we can aggregate everything. And so that's what we estimate. Let me go quickly through this. This is with hypothetical preferences, how the alphas will be different across provided samples. And let me finally do the last thing. So let me skip this. Suppose now that you're interested in parental. So this at the end of. Let me skip this. Suppose that now you're interested in parental investment. So it's a more complex model, and now as we said before, parental investment is determined by resources, tastes, perceptions, and bargaining power. And so let's now use the measures we have to extract factors, latent factors that reflect this stuff. And so on the left-hand side, we have the factor which is parental investment. On the right-hand side, we have a factor that reflects parental tastes for children human capital, and then a factor that reflects bargaining power, and the factor that reflects productivity or beliefs about the investment productivity. So if we ignore who answered the questions in the entire sample, which were 376 observations, so we get the factor on, these are preferences for things other than childhood outcome. So we expect a negative sign, and it's relevant, and it's there, and it's strongly significant, which tells me that these data are actually useful. They're measuring taste in a meaningful way. This is the log total expenditure. It tells you the parental investment is a luxury, but you know it's close to one, so it's not much of a luxury. And then this is when we add the beliefs, which is not significant.
All right.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid.
Sorry.
Running out of time.
Yeah. Let me. This is the last table, and then one more slide after that. So let me. So then we do it for we allow the differences to be across, and then this is the last slide, and this is where we do just with the couples, and here bargaining power is relevant. You know, the beliefs is not significant, but means that I respect the right side. So that's our attempt to use this data in combination with the actual expenditure. Conclusions. I hope I convinced you the measurement is very important. I thought what we can measure should be broad, should include measures of taste, expectations and information, beliefs and attitudes, and how and what we measure should be driven by theory and by the questions that we ask. And much energy should be invested in using appropriately existing measures and constructing new measures. And I'll stop here. You know, all the rest is references. So I will send the slides to Hans and make them available. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Any more questions? There was one opening here in the chat still. Mike, you're still muted.
Hi, Orazio. I was at the beginning. You had a statement that surprised me.
Only one.
Well. You had a statement that you said there are several papers using stated preference data to estimate demand models. And in fact, there are thousands of papers, right?
No, I agree with that. I guess that what you mean by several versus that. Are you referring to a specific literature directory?
Well, I mean, it's like a big part of empirical work in marketing is all about using state.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. And then you know that the marketing thing was not referred to. And you're absolutely right. These guys in marketing and that type of thing, that's what they do. I was more referring to the economics literature.
Yeah. So I was just, you know, I just think there's some key papers in marketing that you ought to be noting. So if you don't mind, I'll just send you a few things.
No, that's exactly the sort of feedback that
yeah. I would just, if I could mention that I had one paper myself. This was 20 some years ago, where I estimated a demand model for health insurance.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just like a random coefficient logit model that we might typically use in economics. But in this data, they happened to also ask the people, how much do you care about having low premiums? How much do you care about having prescription drug coverage? How much do you care about these other attributes on a scale of 1 to 7, you know?
Yeah.
And And I just use, this is very interesting. I just use these 1 to 7 Likert scales as a noisy measure, measurement system of the underlying taste parameters in the mixed logit model. And amazingly, it improved the pseudo R squared of the model by a factor of 2. I mean, these things were extraordinarily useful in predicting demand. And, and I've found it almost impossible to get economists to pay attention to this sort of data. Whereas in marketing, though, it's just very heavily used, it's like,
So thanks a lot, Mike. I mean, I didn't know your paper. I don't know your paper, and I would love to read it. It will definitely be referred to. Among the economists, the most similar type of work that I found is this Andrew Kaplan work, the stuff that he's been doing on nursing homes in the US with the Vanguard. And I think, Andy is doing some interesting work, but among economists, it's not very, very common.
I know, it's definitely true. But I think there's plenty of evidence in marketing that these sort of this data is useful.
Yeah.
In fact, when I in Australia here, I was co-running a center for years. This is what we did, and companies would pay us good money to predict demand for them using these sorts of models with stated preference data. So it does work. At least they think it works.
Thanks a lot, and do send me the relevant references.
I'll send you a few things out.
Great, then let's give Orazio another hand.
Thanks very much for inviting me.